It's hard to imagine a greater betrayal than when a family is shattered. When someone, entrusted with love and protection, becomes the very cause of their demise. The case of Chris Watts is one of the most disturbing examples of this dark reality. A man who, from all appearances, lived a normal suburban life with his wife, 2 daughters, and a 3rd child on the way. But beneath the veneer of a happy family, there was something sinister brewing. A darkness that would soon reveal itself in the most horrific way possible. This is the tragic story of Chris Watts and the annihilation of his family. A story that, even now, years later, still sends chills down the spine of all who hear it. Chris and Shanann Watts seemed like they were living the perfect life. They had met in North Carolina in 2010, and Shanann, who had been going through a tough period in her life, often said that Chris was the best thing that ever happened to her. 2 years later, they married and moved to Frederick, Colorado, where they started their family. Shanann was an active presence on social media, often posting updates about her life, her children, and her relationship with Chris. If you watched her posts, you'd see a loving mother, a hardworking businesswoman, and a woman who adored her husband. She was also a representative for Lavelle, a multi-level marketing company that sold health products. Her job required her to travel frequently, and she often shared her successes online, promoting the brand's lifestyle as a key to her family's happiness. Chris, on the other hand, worked for Anadarko Petroleum Corporation as an operator. His job involved working at oil fields, often in remote areas of Colorado. From the outside looking in, they were your typical middle-class family, striving for the American dream. But behind the posts, the smiles, and the happy photos, trouble had already begun to brew. In early 2018, Shanann told Chris she was pregnant with their 3rd child. They were expecting a boy, and Shanann was overjoyed. She even shared a video on social media where she revealed the news to Chris, who seemed genuinely happy. But that happiness was short-lived. Over the months that followed, Chris began to withdraw from Shanann. He became cold, distant, and emotionally detached. Shanann, already stressed from being pregnant and raising 2 young daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3, could sense something was wrong. In text messages to her friends, Shanann confided that Chris had become a different person. He was no longer affectionate or interested in their relationship. He either shut down or dismissed her concerns when she tried to talk to him. She even suggested marriage counseling, desperate to save their relationship. But Chris seemed uninterested. As Shanann would soon discover, Chris was hiding something. He was having an affair. Chris had begun seeing a coworker, Nicole Kessinger, in the summer of 2018. Unlike Shanann, Nicole was unaware that Chris's wife was pregnant, and she believed that he was in the process of separating from Shanann. They spent time together while Shanann and the girls were away visiting family in North Carolina. Chris told Nicole that his marriage was over and that he was planning to start a new life. But in reality, Chris was living a double life. As his relationship with Nicole intensified, so did the tension in his marriage. Shanann, who was still unaware of the affair, could sense that Chris was pulling away from her and their children. She sent him heartfelt messages, trying to reconnect with him. But Chris's responses were distant and cold. In one message, Shanann even told him that she was afraid he didn't want their baby. What Shanann didn't know at the time was that Chris had already begun to contemplate something unthinkable. Something so horrific, it would soon leave the nation in shock. On August 13th, 2018, the Watts family's world would change forever. Shanann had just returned home from a business trip in Arizona. It was late, around 2 a.m., when she finally walked through the door of the house she shared with her husband, Chris Watts, and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant, had spent the previous few days working, and her friend, Nicole Atkinson, had driven her back home after picking her up from the airport. Nicole noticed nothing out of the ordinary during the ride, and Shanann had even mentioned she was looking forward to seeing Chris and the girls. Despite the growing tensions between her and Chris, there was still hope in her heart. Hope that things would improve, especially with the baby on the way. The baby boy they were expecting was going to be named Nico, a name Shanann had chosen herself. She was so excited about the new addition to their family and in her social media posts, she frequently shared that excitement with her followers. Chris, on the other hand, had seemed distant for some time. Shanann had confided in her friends about the strain in their relationship, but she still held on to the belief that Chris would eventually come around, that things would get better once Nico was born. She hoped that they could rekindle the love they once shared. After arriving home in the early hours of August 13th, 2018, Shanann went straight to bed. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled for later that day, an important checkup to monitor her pregnancy. It was supposed to be a day of excitement, a chance to see how their baby boy was growing. But tragically, Shanann would never make it to that appointment. Later that morning, when Shanann didn't show up for her appointment, Nicole became concerned. She knew Shanann had been looking forward to the visit, and it was unusual for her not to answer her phone. Shanann was diligent and organized, always making sure to keep her commitments. Nicole tried calling her several times, but each time the calls went straight to voicemail. Something didn't feel right. Nicole decided to drive to the Watts' home to check on her friend. When she arrived, she knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She walked around the house, peering through the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of Shanann or the girls. But the house was eerily quiet, and nothing seemed to be out of place. Shanann's car was still in the garage, and the car seats for Bella and Celeste were in their usual spots. Her phone and personal belongings were inside, but Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were nowhere to be found. Growing more alarmed, Nicole called Chris to ask if he had heard from Shanann, but his response was surprisingly calm. He didn't seem overly concerned and told Nicole that Shanann had taken the girls to a playdate, though he didn't seem to know where exactly. Nicole, still uneasy, decided it was time to take more drastic action. She called the police for a welfare check, explaining that Shanann was pregnant, and it wasn't like her to just disappear without saying anything. When the police arrived, they conducted a preliminary search of the house, but Shanann and the girls were still nowhere to be found. The officers noted that Shanann's purse, phone, and medication were inside, which only heightened their concern. How could a pregnant woman, with 2 small children, leave without taking any of her essentials? And why wasn't Chris more alarmed? Chris arrived at the house shortly after the police had begun their search. He greeted the officers with a calm demeanor. Too calm, in fact, given the situation. His wife and daughters were missing, but he didn't seem to grasp the urgency or severity of what was happening. When questioned, Chris stuck to his story that Shanann had taken the girls on a playdate, though he couldn't provide specifics. His answers were vague and lacked the panic one would expect from a father whose entire family had seemingly vanished. Despite his calm exterior, there was something about Chris that felt off. He appeared cooperative, but his demeanor raised red flags with those around him. He wasn't making any desperate pleas for help, and he didn't seem particularly worried. Instead, it felt like he was going through the motions, just another part of his day. It was this detached, almost robotic behavior that set off alarm bells for the investigators. As the hours passed, the police continued to search the Watts' home, and the more they looked, the more suspicious the situation became. Shanann hadn't packed any bags for the girls, and there were no signs that she had planned to leave the house for any extended period of time. Friends and family began to express their concerns as well. They knew Shanann would never leave without telling someone, especially not without her phone or medication. Despite Chris's efforts to appear cooperative, the cracks in his story were beginning to show. As investigators combed through the house and surrounding areas, they started to piece together a timeline of events. Chris's calm, detached demeanor was no longer just suspicious. It was alarming. How could a man whose wife and daughters were missing show so little emotion? Why wasn't he doing more to help the investigation? And why did his answers always seem so vague and rehearsed? It was clear that something wasn't adding up. The more time passed, the more investigators began to zero in on Chris as a person of interest. His behavior was far from that of a distraught husband and father. It was as though he was hiding something. But what? A neighbor's surveillance footage would soon provide a crucial clue. The camera captured Chris backing his truck into the driveway early on the morning of August 13th, loading several items into the vehicle. This footage contradicted Chris's initial claims that he had left for work that morning, believing Shanann and the girls were still asleep inside. The video showed Chris preparing for something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. With this new evidence in hand, the police began to press Chris harder, questioning the inconsistencies in his story. But no matter how much they pushed, Chris maintained his calm, emotionless facade. To those around him, it was clear that he was hiding something dark and terrible. But what could drive a man to such cold indifference in the face of his family's disappearance? As the investigation continued, the police and the public alike began to suspect the worst. Shanann and the girls weren't missing. They were gone. And Chris Watts, the man who had once been seen as a loving husband and father, was now the prime suspect in their disappearance. The dark cloud of suspicion that had been forming around Chris from the beginning was now impossible to ignore. The case was unraveling, and the horrifying truth was about to be revealed. The next steps in the investigation would expose a truth so chilling, it left an entire nation in shock. The man who was supposed to protect his family had, in fact, been the one to destroy it. And as the days passed, Chris Watts' horrifying secret would come to light, forever staining the Watts family name and leaving behind a legacy of unimaginable tragedy. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please consider subscribing. We upload multiple crime videos every week. You can browse through our video library to get more videos like this. In the days following the disappearance of Shanann Watts and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste, Chris Watts made several public appearances, seeking to rally the community in the search for his missing family. He stood in front of cameras on local news stations, pleading for anyone with information to come forward and assist in locating his wife and children. At first glance, these appearances seemed like the desperate actions of a man who had lost everything. But as the days wore on, something about Chris's demeanor began to raise serious concerns. Chris appeared on television, visibly distressed, but his distress seemed oddly subdued and calculated. In his public appeals, he often focused on the emotional toll the situation had taken on him, rather than on the well-being of Shanann and the girls. He spoke about how the situation made him feel, how he was struggling to cope with the absence of his family, and how the whole ordeal was impacting him personally. This self-centered approach struck many viewers as peculiar and unsettling. Instead of expressing the raw, palpable grief one would expect from a father and husband in such a tragic situation, Chris's words and demeanor felt forced, almost rehearsed. To the trained eyes of law enforcement, this behavior was a significant red flag. Investigators, who had seen countless cases of missing persons and had become adept at recognizing the signs of deception, noted that Chris's emotional responses seemed inconsistent with the gravity of the situation. His lack of genuine concern for the safety of Shanann and the girls, coupled with his focus on how the disappearance affected him personally, suggested that something was amiss. The public also picked up on these discrepancies. As Chris continued to appear on news broadcasts and make public statements, many viewers began to question his sincerity. Social media discussions were abuzz with speculation about his behavior. Comments pointed out how Chris seemed detached and unemotional, not displaying the kind of anguish one would expect from a man whose loved ones had disappeared. This growing unease among the public and law enforcement alike only served to heighten the scrutiny on Chris. Chris's media appearances were part of a broader pattern that law enforcement would later recognize as indicative of his deceptive nature. His demeanor during these appearances did not match the urgency and distress that one would typically associate with a genuine plea for the safe return of loved ones. Instead, his actions seemed to reflect a deeper, more troubling reality. As the investigation progressed, the inconsistencies in Chris's public statements became even more pronounced. He was asked repeatedly about the details of the last time he saw Shanann and the girls, and his responses were often vague and contradictory. For example, he initially claimed that Shanann had left with the girls on the morning of August 13th, but security footage later showed him loading his truck with items before they were reported missing. This footage, combined with his unusual behavior, made it increasingly clear to investigators that Chris's story was falling apart. The psychological profile of Chris, based on his public appearances and interactions with law enforcement, suggested a man who was more focused on self-preservation than on genuinely seeking his family's safe return. His inability to display genuine emotion and his apparent detachment from the situation painted a troubling picture. It became evident that Chris was not the distraught husband and father he was trying to portray, but was instead a man with a much darker secret. In retrospect, Chris's behavior during these media appearances was a critical element in unraveling the truth of what had happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. It highlighted the chasm between his public facade and the horrifying reality that was about to come to light. His apparent lack of genuine emotion, combined with the discrepancies in his story, ultimately contributed to the growing suspicion that he was involved in his family's disappearance and, more tragically, their deaths. As the investigation delved deeper, the cracks in Chris's story would widen, leading to the shocking revelation of the truth behind the Watts family's disappearance. What began as a search for a missing family would soon uncover a tragedy that shocked the nation and left an indelible mark on those who followed the case. Behind the scenes of the media frenzy surrounding the disappearance of Shanann Watts and her daughters, Bella and Celeste, a meticulous investigation was underway. The crucial breakthrough came from a neighbor's security camera footage from the morning of August 13th. This footage played a pivotal role in unraveling the tragic events that had transpired. The video footage showed Chris Watts backing his truck into his driveway early that morning, long before he had reported his family missing. It revealed him loading what appeared to be bags into the vehicle. This revelation was crucial, as it directly contradicted Chris's earlier claims that Shanann and the girls had left for an unknown destination while he was at work. The sight of Chris handling these bags under the cover of early morning hours raised immediate suspicion and cast doubt on his account of the events. Equipped with this damning evidence, investigators brought Chris in for questioning. Initially, Chris maintained his innocence, sticking to the story he had previously told. However, the pressure mounted as investigators presented the video evidence and confronted him with inconsistencies in his story. To further probe his truthfulness, they asked Chris to take a polygraph test, a standard investigative tool used to assess whether someone is lying. The results of the polygraph were unequivocal. Chris failed the test. The failure of the polygraph was a critical turning point in the investigation. It suggested that Chris was not being truthful and provided investigators with the leverage they needed to delve deeper into his story. With his credibility in question, the interrogation took a more intense turn. During the interrogation, Chris was given an opportunity to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts, in the same room. This moment of vulnerability appeared to be a strategic move by the investigators to break Chris down emotionally and compel him to confess. It was during this emotionally charged moment that Chris made a partial confession. He admitted to killing Shanann, but attempted to deflect some of the blame by claiming that Shanann had strangled their two daughters. According to Chris, he had killed Shanann in a fit of rage after discovering her actions. Investigators were quick to recognize the implausibility of Chris's account. The evidence, including the autopsies of Shanann and the girls, did not support his version of events. Shanann had been strangled, while Bella and Celeste had been smothered. This evidence directly contradicted Chris's claim that Shanann had been responsible for the deaths of their daughters. The investigators knew that Chris was still holding back crucial details, and that his confession, though partially true, was far from complete. The relentless questioning and the mounting evidence eventually led Chris to a fuller confession. He admitted to the complete and horrifying truth. He had indeed strangled Shanann and had smothered both Bella and Celeste. Chris's detailed admission provided a grim picture of the events that transpired on that fateful day. He described how he had killed Shanann in their home and then transported her body, along with his daughters' bodies, to an oil field where he disposed of them. Bella and Celeste were found in oil tanks, while Shanann was buried in a shallow grave. Chris's confession was a chilling revelation of the brutality and premeditation behind the murders. It brought to light the horrifying reality of what had happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and marked the beginning of the legal process that would follow. The details of Chris's actions left a lasting impact on the families involved, the public, and everyone who followed the case. As the investigation progressed, the full extent of Chris Watts's crimes became clear. His initial attempts to shift blame and his failed polygraph test were just the beginning of a tragic story that would unfold in the courtroom and in the media. The case became a poignant reminder of the complexities and dark sides of human behavior, and it underscored the importance of thorough investigative work in uncovering the truth behind such horrific events. As the horrifying details of the murders committed by Chris Watts began to emerge, the full gravity of his actions and the depth of his depravity became chillingly clear. On the morning of August 13, 2018, following a confrontation with his wife, Shanann, Chris committed an unthinkable atrocity. In their own bedroom, he strangled Shanann to death. Her life abruptly ended in the very place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for their family. At the time of this violent act, their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, were still alive within the house. The innocence and trust that they placed in their father were tragically betrayed in the most heart-wrenching way. Unaware of the horrific fate that had befallen their mother, the little girls were left in a state of confusion and fear. After killing Shanann, Chris's depravity extended further as he meticulously executed his gruesome plan. He loaded Shanann's lifeless body into his truck, alongside his unsuspecting daughters, who remained oblivious to the enormity of the tragedy that had unfolded. Driven by a cold, calculated mindset, Chris transported them to a remote oil field operated by Anadarko, the company where he was employed. This desolate and isolated location would become the site of the final, horrifying stages of his plan. Upon arriving at the oil field, Chris took the first step in disposing of Shanann's body. He buried her in a shallow grave near the oil tanks, a stark contrast to the life and vitality that had once characterized their home. With Shanann's body concealed, Chris then turned his attention to his daughters, whose lives he was about to end in the most brutal manner. One by one, he smothered Bella and Celeste, using the same cruel indifference that marked the rest of his actions. Bella, the older of the two girls, fought valiantly against the final moments of her life. According to Chris, Bella's last words were a heart-wrenching plea. "Daddy, no." This desperate cry for help from a child who had loved and trusted him reveals the unimaginable horror and helplessness that Bella and Celeste must have felt in their final moments. The enormity of Chris Watts' actions is almost beyond comprehension. The act of killing one's spouse is an unthinkable betrayal, but to extend such brutality to innocent children who trusted him, loved him unconditionally, and in their final moments begged for their lives, reveals a depth of evil that is profoundly disturbing. The coldness required to execute such a plan and the complete disregard for the lives and trust of his family are staggering. The impact of these events extends far beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. They touch on deep, unsettling questions about the nature of human evil and the capacity for violence that can lurk behind the facade of normalcy. As the details of Chris Watts' crimes continued to unfold, the world was left grappling with the haunting reality of how a man could perpetrate such an atrocity against those he was supposed to protect and cherish. The grief and trauma inflicted on the victims' families and the wider community serve as a solemn reminder of the profound consequences of such acts of violence and betrayal. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, as well as additional charges for tampering with bodies and the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy. The case moved swiftly, and in November 2018, Chris pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. On November 19th, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Shanann's family delivered emotional victim impact statements. Her father, Frank Razuchek, called Chris a monster and said that his actions had shattered their lives. Her mother, Sandra, expressed her heartbreak over losing not just Shanann, but Bella, Celeste, and her unborn grandson, Nico. Chris, for his part, offered no explanation for his actions. He showed no remorse and offered no apologies. He simply sat there, stone-faced, as the court handed down its sentence. In the aftermath of his conviction, Chris provided further details about the murders in a February 2019 interview with investigators. He admitted that the murders were premeditated. He had planned them in advance, and his earlier claims of acting in a fit of rage were false. He also described how, in the days leading up to the murders, He had been contemplating a future with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger. In his mind, the only way to fully pursue that new life was to eliminate his family. To make matters even more chilling, Chris confessed that he had smothered his daughters twice. After initially attempting to smother them in their beds, the girls had woken up, dazed and confused. Rather than abandoning his plan, Chris continued, eventually taking their lives at the oil site. It was a level of cruelty that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. In the years since the murders, Chris Watts has become the subject of widespread media attention. Documentaries, interviews, and countless news segments have been produced, all trying to make sense of why a seemingly normal man would do something so evil. Some have speculated that Chris suffered from a personality disorder, while others point to his affair with Nicole Kessinger as the catalyst for his actions. Nicole, who cooperated with investigators and claimed she had no knowledge of the murders, has since gone into hiding to escape the public eye. The Watts case has also drawn attention to the phenomenon of family annihilators, men who kill their families, often as a way to escape financial or personal pressures. According to experts, these killers often exhibit narcissistic tendencies and view their families as obstacles to their own happiness. But while there may be psychological explanations for Chris's actions, they do little to provide comfort to those who were left behind. Shanann's family continues to grieve the loss of their daughter and grandchildren. They have worked to keep Shanann's memory alive, and they continue to advocate for victims of domestic violence. The Chris Watts case is a sobering reminder that evil can sometimes lurk behind the most ordinary of facades. To the outside world, Chris and Shanann Watts appeared to be the perfect family. They had a nice house, good jobs, and 2 beautiful daughters. But beneath the surface, there was a darkness that no one could have predicted. It's a story that has haunted many and will continue to do so for years to come. Because in the end, the Chris Watts case isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about betrayal, about the fragility of human life, and about the unimaginable consequences of unchecked evil. May we never forget the lives of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico. And may their story serve as a stark warning that sometimes the greatest danger lies within the people we trust the most. If you want more true crime stories like this every week, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Thank you, and goodbye for now.